Welcome and thank you for being here. In the hours ahead, we will journey together across the dark waters of the North Atlantic, following a story of patience, persistence, and discovery. This is a tale told in soft tones, meant to accompany you as you rest, as you drift, as you let the day fall gently away. Before we begin, let us acknowledge with quiet respect that the Titanic's story began with profound loss. More than 1,500 souls were lost on that April night in 1912, and their memory deserves our reverence. In this telling, we will focus not on the tragedy of the sinking, but on the decades of mystery that followed, and on the patient searchers who finally found the great ship resting on the ocean floor. This is a story of those who looked, and those who waited, and those who never stopped believing that someday the Atlantic would yield its secret. So settle in now. Adjust your pillow if you need to. Let the soft rhythm of distant waves become your companion and allow your thoughts to drift toward the sea. We have a long, gentle journey ahead, and there is no need to hurry. Take a slow breath and let the hum of the ocean settle around you. On the first day of September 1985, in the quiet hours before dawn, a small team of researchers aboard the vessel stared at their monitors with tired eyes and patient hearts. They floated above waters that stretched 370 miles southeast of the coast of Newfoundland, where the Atlantic runs deep and cold and dark. For 73 years, the wreck of the Titanic had remained hidden beneath nearly 4 kilometers of ocean. More than a dozen expeditions had sought her resting place without success. And on this particular night, a towed camera system called Argo descended on a single slender cable, carrying lights and lenses into depths where no sunlight had reached since the world began. 3 facts anchored this moment in history. The Titanic had been lost for nearly 3/4 of a century. The technology to find her had only recently become possible, and the crew aboard the Nor had just 12 days remaining in their search before the season would force them home. In the next 3 hours together, we will trace the full arc of this quiet triumph. By minute 2, we will stand on the deck of the Nor as the expedition takes shape. By minute 4, we will understand the remarkable technology that made this discovery possible. And by minute 6, we will witness the first ghostly images rising from the deep as a massive boiler appears on a grainy monitor screen. This is the story of patience measured in decades, of hope that refused to fade, and of a night when the ocean finally shared what it had hidden for so long. The water is calm tonight. The ship rocks gently, and somewhere far below, in the absolute darkness of the seafloor, the Titanic waits. Let us begin. The cables descend, the cameras hum softly, and we now turn back the clock to understand how this moment came to be. To understand the discovery, we must first understand the silence that preceded it. A silence that lasted 73 years, during which the Titanic rested unseen and unreachable beneath the cold waters of the Atlantic. On the night of April 14, 1912, the Titanic struck ice in the darkness and slipped beneath the waves in the early hours of the following morning. The loss was staggering. More than 1,500 passengers and crew were lost to the freezing sea, and the world recoiled in grief and disbelief. In the days that followed, rescue ships retrieved those who had survived in lifeboats, while the great ship herself descended through thousands of meters of water to settle on the ocean floor. And there she remained, invisible and silent for the rest of the century. In the immediate aftermath, there was talk of finding the wreck, of raising her from the depths, of recovering what had been lost. But the technology of 1912 could not reach the seafloor where she lay. The ocean at that depth was a realm beyond human access, a place of crushing pressure and absolute darkness where no diver could survive and no vessel could descend. The Titanic had passed beyond the reach of the living world. As the years passed, the urgency of finding the wreck faded. 2 world wars reshaped the globe. New ships crossed the Atlantic, sleeker and safer, and the era of the great ocean liners slowly gave way to the age of aviation. The Titanic became a memory, a cautionary tale, a ghost story told to remind humanity of its own fragility. But the question remained, quiet and persistent in the minds of historians, scientists, and dreamers alike. Where exactly did she come to rest? The last confirmed position of the Titanic was known only approximately. The distress signals sent on that fateful night provided coordinates, but those coordinates marked where the ship had been when she began to sink, not where she had finally settled. The ocean floor in that region was not flat but varied, with underwater hills and valleys that stretched for miles. A ship falling through nearly 4 kilometers of water could drift significantly from its last surface position, carried by currents, tumbling as it descended. Without knowing precisely where she lay, finding the Titanic was like searching for a single house in a city the size of Manhattan, but with no map, no addresses, and no way to see more than a few feet in any direction. Several expeditions attempted the search in the decades that followed, using the best technology available at the time. In 1980, a Texas oilman named Jack Grimm sponsored a series of expeditions that scoured the seabed with sonar and cameras. The Grimm expeditions were well-funded and determined, but the Atlantic is vast, and the equipment of that era could only reveal small patches of the ocean floor at a time. During one of these expeditions, the team believed they had found a propeller blade from the Titanic, but the claim was never confirmed. The ocean kept its secret. Other attempts met similar frustration. Ships would spend weeks at sea, their crews staring at sonar screens and lowering cameras into the darkness, only to return to port with nothing but empty images of sediment and rock. The search area was simply too large, the technology too limited, and the ocean too indifferent to human hope. Year after year, the Titanic remained unfound. It is worth pausing here to consider what the searchers were facing. The Titanic lay in what oceanographers call the abyssal zone, a region of the ocean that begins at around 3,000 meters and extends to the bottom of the deepest trenches. At these depths, the water temperature hovers just above freezing. The pressure is immense, hundreds of times greater than at the surface, enough to crush an unprotected human body instantly. No sunlight penetrates to these depths. The only illumination comes from the occasional bioluminescence of deep-sea creatures, tiny sparks of cold light in an endless darkness. The seafloor itself is covered in fine sediment, accumulated over millions of years, creating a landscape that is both alien and strangely peaceful. To search for a shipwreck in this environment required not just courage but technology that, for most of the 20th century, simply did not exist. The cameras had to withstand enormous pressure. The lights had to pierce absolute darkness. The vehicles had to be controlled from miles above, through cables that transmitted commands and returned images with agonizing slowness. Progress came gradually. In the 1960s and 70s, deep-sea submersibles began to open the abyss to human exploration. The famous Alvin, operated by Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, descended to depths that had previously been unreachable, returning with observations that transformed our understanding of the deep ocean. But even Alvin could not search vast areas efficiently. It could visit a site, but it could not sweep the ocean floor in the systematic way that finding a single shipwreck would require. And so the Titanic remained hidden, her location a mystery that seemed destined to endure forever. But mysteries have a way of attracting dreamers. And among those who dreamed of finding the Titanic, one man would prove more persistent, more ingenious, and more patient than all the rest. His name was Robert Ballard, and he had been thinking about the Titanic since he was a boy. In the stillness of university libraries and the cluttered offices of research institutions, Ballard studied the problem, turning it over in his mind like a puzzle that refused to be solved. He knew that brute force searching would never work. The ocean was too large, the resources too limited. If the Titanic was ever to be found, it would require a different approach, a cleverer strategy and technology that had not yet been invented. For years, Ballard refined his ideas, tested new equipment, and waited for the moment when everything would align. He cultivated relationships with the United States Navy, which had its own reasons for developing deep-sea exploration technology. He collaborated with French oceanographers who were advancing the science of sonar imaging. And he never lost faith that someday the puzzle would be solved. The Atlantic is patient, and so was Robert Ballard. For 7 decades, the Atlantic kept its secret, and we will now trace the quiet patience of those who refuse to stop looking. Robert Ballard was born in 1942 in Wichita, Kansas, far from the ocean that would define his life. But even in the landlocked heart of America, the sea called to him. He would later recall spending hours at the public library, paging through books about ocean exploration, submarines, and the mysteries that lay beneath the waves. When Ballard was a boy, his family moved to San Diego, California, and suddenly the Pacific Ocean was at his doorstep. He spent his adolescence swimming, diving, and dreaming about what might be found in the depths. The ocean became not just a hobby but an obsession, a lifelong fascination that would shape every decision he made. In school, Ballard excelled in science and mathematics, the tools he would later need to turn his dreams into reality. He attended the University of California, then the University of Hawaii, studying marine geology and chemistry. He served in the United States Navy, learning the discipline and precision that military training instills. And eventually, he found his way to Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, the prestigious research center on Cape Cod that would become his professional home. Woods Hole was, and remains, one of the world's premier institutions for ocean research. Founded in 1930, it had grown into a sprawling complex of laboratories, libraries, and workshops, where some of the most brilliant minds in marine science gathered to study the deep. The institution operated a fleet of research vessels, and most importantly, the deep-sea submersible Alvin, which could carry researchers to depths that had previously been impossible to reach. Ballard arrived at Woods Hole in 1967 and quickly established himself as an innovative and ambitious researcher. He was not content to study the ocean from the surface. He wanted to go down, to see with his own eyes the landscapes that lay beneath miles of water. Throughout the 1970s, Ballard participated in numerous deep-sea expeditions. He dove in Alvin to explore underwater mountain ranges and volcanic vents. He witnessed the strange creatures that thrived in the absolute darkness of the abyss, organisms that derived their energy not from sunlight, but from chemicals seeping from the ocean floor. These experiences transformed his understanding of the deep and convinced him that the technology for systematic deep-sea exploration was finally within reach. But throughout these years of professional success, one thought never left Ballard's mind: the Titanic. He knew that finding the Titanic would require more than a submersible that could reach the right depth. Alvin could descend to the wreck site, but it moved too slowly and could see too little at a time to search the vast area where the ship might lie. What was needed was a new kind of technology, something that could sweep large sections of the seafloor systematically, sending back images in real time. Ballard began to imagine a towed camera system, a vehicle that would be dragged behind a ship at the end of a long cable, carrying cameras and lights that could photograph the ocean floor continuously as the ship moved above. Such a system could cover vastly more territory than a submersible, creating a kind of moving eye that would scan the seabed hour after hour, day after day. But building such a system was expensive, and funding for speculative deep-sea exploration was scarce. Ballard needed a patron, someone with resources and a reason to invest in the technology he envisioned. That patron, as it turned out, would be the United States Navy. The Navy had its own interests in the deep ocean. During the Cold War, submarines were the most valuable and vulnerable assets in the American military. They prowled the depths, carrying nuclear missiles and gathering intelligence, and when one was lost, recovering it, or at least understanding what had happened, became a matter of national security. In 1963, the nuclear submarine USS Thresher had sunk during a test dive off the coast of New England, killing all 129 men aboard. 5 years later, another nuclear submarine, USS Scorpion, was lost in the Atlantic under mysterious circumstances. Both wrecks lay on the ocean floor, their exact locations known, but never fully explored. The Navy wanted to know more about what had happened to these submarines, and they needed the technology to examine the wrecks in detail. When Ballard approached them with his vision for a towed camera system, they saw an opportunity. A deal was struck. The Navy would fund the development of Ballard's camera system, and provide ship time for testing. In exchange, Ballard would use the system first to examine the wrecks of Thresher and Scorpion. Only after these classified missions were complete would he be free to search for the Titanic. It was a bargain that required patience and discretion. Ballard could not speak publicly about the submarine work, and he had to complete the Navy's missions before pursuing his own dream. But the arrangement gave him something invaluable: the resources to build the technology he needed. And so, through the early 1980s, Ballard and his team at Woods Hole developed the system that would eventually find the Titanic. They called it Argo. Argo was a steel sled equipped with cameras and powerful lights, designed to be towed behind a ship at the end of a cable nearly 4 miles long. As the ship moved slowly across the surface, Argo would glide above the ocean floor, sending a continuous stream of images back to monitors on the vessel above. Operators could watch in real time as the seafloor passed beneath them, noting any features that warranted closer inspection. The system was revolutionary. Previous searches had relied on sonar, which could detect the shape of the bottom but could not provide visual detail. Argo's cameras could actually see what was down there, distinguishing between rocks and wreckage, between natural formations and man-made objects. But Argo was only half of the vision. Ballard also developed a smaller vehicle called Jason Jr., a remotely operated robot that could be deployed from a submersible to explore confined spaces that the larger vehicles could not enter. Together, Argo and Jason represented a new era in deep-sea exploration, one in which human eyes could finally penetrate the darkness of the abyss. Throughout these years of development, Ballard never lost sight of his ultimate goal. He studied everything that was known about the Titanic's sinking, analyzing the distress signals, the survivor testimonies, the currents and conditions of that April night. He refined his theories about where the ship might lie, and he planned the search with meticulous care. In the quiet of his office, surrounded by charts and models, Ballard waited for the moment when all the pieces would come together. The technology was nearly ready. The Navy's submarine missions would soon be complete, and the Atlantic, patient and eternal, continued to guard its secret. But not for much longer. In the stillness of his office, surrounded by charts and models, one man held onto a dream that others had abandoned. While Robert Ballard refined his vision in Massachusetts, another team of oceanographers was developing its own expertise on the far side of the Atlantic. In France, the National Oceanographic Institute, known as IFREMER, had become a leader in deep-sea sonar technology, and among their most skilled researchers was a man named Jean-Louis Mitchell. Mitchell was a quiet, methodical scientist, the kind of person who found satisfaction in solving complex problems through careful analysis and patient observation. He had spent years developing and operating sonar systems capable of mapping the ocean floor with unprecedented precision. Where cameras showed what was there, sonar revealed the shape of the terrain, the contours and features that lay hidden beneath the darkness. The two technologies, cameras and sonar, were complementary. Together, they could accomplish what neither could achieve alone. And when the opportunity arose to search for the Titanic, it became clear that a collaboration between American and French teams would multiply the chances of success. The partnership was formalized in the early 1980s. IFREMER would contribute their sophisticated sonar system, called SAR, along with their ship Le Surete and the expertise of Jean-Louis Mitchell and his colleagues. Woods Hole would contribute Argo and the experience of Robert Ballard's team. Together, they would mount a joint expedition to finally locate the lost liner. The French team's approach was based on sound rather than light. SAR, which stood for Sonar Acoustique Remorque, was a side-scan sonar system that could map large swaths of the ocean floor by bouncing acoustic signals off the seabed and analyzing the echoes. The system could detect objects and features that rose above the surrounding sediment, including, theoretically, the hull of a sunken ship. Mitchell and his colleagues spent months preparing for the expedition. They studied the historical records, analyzed the currents and conditions, and divided the likely search area into a grid of parallel tracks that Le Surete would follow systematically. Each pass of the ship would sweep a strip of ocean floor with sonar, and over time, the accumulated data would create a comprehensive map of the entire search zone. It was tedious work, the kind that required extraordinary patience. The ship would move slowly across the surface, its sonar array towed behind, while technicians monitored the returning signals on screens below deck. Hour after hour, day after day, the process continued, each pass adding another strip to the growing map. The French team understood that success was not guaranteed. The search area was vast, and even the best sonar system could miss a target if conditions were unfavorable or if the wreck had been buried by sediment over the decades. But they also understood that systematic persistence was the only approach that had any chance of working. The Titanic would not be found by luck. It would be found by exhaustive, methodical searching. Jean-Louis Mitchell brought to this task the same quiet determination that characterized Robert Ballard. Both men understood that the ocean could not be rushed, that finding the Titanic would require not just technology, but time, patience, and an acceptance that many days of searching might yield nothing at all. The collaboration between the American and French teams was not merely practical but symbolic. The Titanic had been built in Belfast, owned by a British company, and lost on a voyage between England and America. Passengers from dozens of countries had been aboard on that final crossing. Now, researchers from 2 continents were joining forces to solve a mystery that had haunted the world for generations. Communications between the teams flowed across the Atlantic, as Mitchell and Ballard coordinated their plans, shared data, and refined their strategies. The French would begin the search, using sonar to eliminate large sections of the ocean floor and narrow down the most promising areas. When Le Surete completed its campaign, the American team would arrive with Argo to provide visual confirmation of any targets identified by sonar. The plan was sound, but both teams knew that plans often faltered when confronted with the reality of the deep ocean. Weather could delay operations. Equipment could fail. The wreck might lie in terrain that confounded their instruments. 100 variables could determine the difference between success and failure. Still, they prepared with care and optimism. The summer of 1985 was approaching, and with it, the narrow window of acceptable weather in the North Atlantic. Soon, the ships would sail, the equipment would be deployed, and the search would begin in earnest. In laboratories and workshops on both sides of the Atlantic, the final preparations were made. Cables were tested, cameras calibrated, sonar systems checked and rechecked. The researchers knew that they were attempting something that had never been done before, a systematic search of the deep ocean for a single specific wreck across hundreds of square miles of featureless seafloor. The odds were long, but the teams were ready. And soon, they would put their technology and their patience to the ultimate test. Across the Atlantic, another team of patient researchers prepared their own vessel, their own instruments, and their own hopes. Before we continue with the story of the Titanic search, we must pause to explore a chapter that remained hidden from the public for many years. The expedition that found the Titanic began not with dreams of maritime history, but with the classified requirements of the United States Navy. As we mentioned earlier, Robert Ballard had made an arrangement with the Navy. They would fund his deep-sea camera system and provide the ship time he needed to test it. In return, he would use the technology first to examine the wrecks of 2 nuclear submarines that had been lost during the Cold War. The submarines were USS Thresher, lost in 1963, and USS Scorpion, lost in 1968. Both had sunk under circumstances that remained not fully understood, and both lay at depths that had made detailed examination impossible. The Navy wanted to know what had happened to these vessels, to learn from the tragedies, and to assess any ongoing risks from the nuclear reactors they carried. This was sensitive work, both technically and politically. The wrecks contained classified technology, and the findings of any examination would have implications for submarine design and naval policy. Ballard was required to maintain strict secrecy about this aspect of his mission, even as he publicly discussed his hopes of finding the Titanic. The arrangement suited both parties. The Navy got the expertise and technology they needed to examine the submarine wrecks. Ballard got the resources to build Argo and, crucially, the ship time that would allow him to search for the Titanic once the Navy's requirements were satisfied. In the summer of 1985, as the world waited to hear about the Titanic search, Ballard first turned his attention to the submarines. Using Argo and the research vessel Nor, he descended to the depths where Thresher and Scorpion lay and conducted the detailed surveys the Navy required. What he found during these classified dives would remain secret for years, shared only with Navy officials and a small circle of cleared personnel. But the experience taught Ballard something that would prove crucial for the Titanic search. When a large vessel sinks in deep water, it does not simply drop straight down to the ocean floor. As it falls through miles of water, it may tumble, break apart, or drift with underwater currents. Debris separates from the main hull and spreads across the seafloor in a pattern that scientists call a debris field. Examining the submarine wrecks, Ballard observed how debris had scattered across the ocean bottom, creating trails of artifacts that extended far from the main hull. The lighter objects, carried farther by currents, formed a kind of path leading back to the heavier, less mobile sections of the wreck. This observation sparked an idea. If you were searching for a large wreck like the Titanic, you might have better luck looking for the debris field first. The debris field would cover a much larger area than the hull itself, making it easier to find. Once you located the debris, you could follow it back to the main wreckage. It was a simple insight, but it transformed Ballard's search strategy. Instead of looking for the Titanic herself, a single target in a vast ocean, he would look for the scattered evidence of her presence, the trail of objects that had fallen from her decks as she sank. The Navy missions were completed successfully, though the details remained classified. And when they were done, Ballard finally had what he had been waiting years to receive: permission to search for the Titanic. But time was running short. The summer season was already advanced, and the weather in the North Atlantic would soon turn unfavorable. The French team aboard Le Surite was already at sea, conducting their sonar survey. And Ballard had only a narrow window remaining, perhaps 2 weeks at most, to use Argo in the search before conditions would force everyone home. It was not much time, but it would have to be enough. After years of preparation, after the long detour through classified Navy work, after the patient development of technology that could see in the darkness of the deep, Robert Ballard was finally free to pursue his dream. On August 19, 1985, the Nor set sail from the Azores, heading for the search area in the North Atlantic. Aboard the vessel, the American team made final preparations, testing Argo and reviewing the data that the French had gathered. The secret was finally over. The classified work was complete, and somewhere beneath the waves, the Titanic waited to be found. Before the Titanic could be sought, other secrets of the deep had to be visited first, in silence and solitude. In workshops far from the sea, the technology that would find the Titanic slowly took shape. The vehicle was called Argo, named for the ship that carried Jason and the Argonauts in Greek mythology. It was, in its way, a vessel of exploration, though it would never float upon the water. Instead, Argo would sink to the ocean floor, towed behind a ship at the end of a cable nearly 4 miles long. To understand what made Argo revolutionary, we must first understand the challenge it was designed to overcome. The Titanic lay at a depth of approximately 3,800 meters, more than 2 miles below the surface. At that depth, the water pressure is enormous, roughly 380 times greater than at the surface. Any equipment sent down must be built to withstand forces that would crush an ordinary camera or electronic device instantly. Previous deep-sea cameras had been limited in what they could accomplish. They could take photographs, but the images had to be brought back to the surface for processing, a delay that made real-time searching impossible. And because submersibles moved slowly and could see only a small area at a time, systematic searching of large regions was impractical. Argo changed all of that. The vehicle was built on a steel frame, roughly the size of a small car, weighing about 4,000 pounds. Its hull was designed to withstand the crushing pressures of the deep ocean, protecting the sensitive electronics housed inside. Multiple video cameras pointed in different directions, providing overlapping views of the ocean floor. Powerful lights capable of illuminating the darkness were mounted on the frame. But the most important feature of Argo was its connection to the surface. A specialized cable, containing both power lines and fiber optic strands, ran from the vehicle up to the ship above. This cable allowed the cameras to transmit images in real time, so that operators aboard the ship could watch the ocean floor passing beneath Argo as if they were looking through a window into the deep. The cable itself was a marvel of engineering. It had to be strong enough to support the weight of the vehicle dangling miles below, yet flexible enough to be wound on a winch and deployed repeatedly. The fiber optics had to transmit clear video signals over a distance of several miles, without interference or degradation. And the entire system had to function reliably in the harsh conditions of deep ocean work. Developing Argo took years of patient work. Engineers solved one problem only to encounter another. Cameras that worked in the laboratory failed under pressure. Cables frayed or kinked. Lights burned out or leaked. Each failure prompted a redesign, a modification, a new approach. The team at Woods Hole persisted. They tested components in pressure chambers that simulated deep ocean conditions. They ran cables through thousands of bending cycles to ensure they would not break. They refined the video transmission system until the images were clear and stable. By the time Argo was ready for operational use, it represented the most advanced deep-sea imaging system ever built. The vehicle could be towed at speeds of about 1 knot, slow enough to capture clear images, fast enough to cover meaningful distances. As the ship above moved across the surface, Argo would glide perhaps 50 to 100 feet above the ocean floor, its cameras scanning the terrain below. Operators aboard the ship could adjust the towing depth, slow down to examine interesting features, or speed up to cover barren stretches more quickly. But Argo was only one part of the system. Alongside it, Ballard's team developed a smaller vehicle called Jason Jr., often abbreviated as JJ. This was a remotely operated robot, about the size of a lawn mower, equipped with its own cameras and lights. Jason Jr. could be deployed from a submersible to explore places that larger vehicles could not reach, swimming through doorways, peering into rooms, navigating the confined spaces of a sunken ship. Together, Argo and Jason Jr. represented a new generation of deep-sea technology. Argo would find the wreck, sweeping across the ocean floor with its cameras. Then Jason Jr. could explore the interior, capturing images that would help scientists understand what had happened to the ship and what remained after decades on the bottom. The vision was ambitious, but the technology was sound. Years of development had prepared these machines for the task ahead. All that remained was to put them to use. As the summer of 1985 approached, Argo was loaded aboard the research vessel Noor. Technicians ran final tests, checking every camera, every light, every foot of cable. The machine that would carry human sight into the abyss was ready. Robert Ballard stood on the deck and looked out at the horizon. Somewhere out there beneath the gray Atlantic, the Titanic waited, and now, at last, he had the eyes to find her. In workshops far from the sea, Engineers built a machine that could carry human sight into places human bodies could never go. Finding the Titanic was not simply a matter of sailing to the right spot and looking down. The ocean is vast, the deep is dark, and even with the most advanced technology, searching for a single shipwreck requires careful calculation and methodical strategy. The search area was determined by historical records and scientific analysis. The Titanic's last known position, transmitted in distress signals on the night she sank, provided a starting point. But that position marked where the ship had been when she was still at the surface, not where she had finally come to rest on the ocean floor. A ship sinking through nearly 4 kilometers of water does not fall straight down. It tumbles, drifts, and is pushed by underwater currents. Depending on conditions, the final resting place could be miles from the last surface position. The challenge was to predict where the ship had likely ended up and to design a search pattern that would cover all the possibilities. Oceanographers analyzed the currents in the region, studying how water moves at different depths and how those movements change with the seasons. They considered the likely path of debris falling from the ship, the speed at which heavy objects would sink compared to lighter ones, and the effects of the seafloor terrain on where materials might accumulate. From this analysis, they defined a search box, a rectangular area of ocean floor that encompassed all the plausible locations where the Titanic might lie. The box measured roughly 150 square miles, an area larger than some cities, covered in sediment and darkness. To search this entire area, the expedition would have to be systematic. Random searching would be hopeless. The odds of stumbling upon the wreck by chance were vanishingly small. Instead, the plan called for methodical passes back and forth across the search box, like mowing a lawn, each pass overlapping slightly with the previous one to ensure that nothing was missed. The French team aboard Le Surete would begin the process, using their sonar to sweep across the search area. Sonar could cover more ground than cameras, detecting features that rose above the surrounding sediment. If the Titanic's hull was exposed, the sonar should be able to find it. But sonar had limitations. It could detect shapes, but it could not distinguish between a rock formation and a shipwreck. It might miss a wreck that was heavily buried or broken into pieces. And interpreting sonar data required expertise and patience, as the signals could be ambiguous. After the sonar survey, the American team would arrive with Argo, using cameras to visually confirm any targets identified by sonar, and to search the areas where the debris field was most likely to be found. The cameras could see what sonar could only hint at, providing the definitive proof that the Titanic had been located. This division of labor made sense. Sonar was faster but less certain. Cameras were slower but more conclusive. By combining the two, the expedition maximized its chances of success. But even with both technologies, success was not guaranteed. The search area was large, the time available was limited, and the ocean could always surprise. Currents might have carried the wreck to an unexpected location. Sediment might have buried it beyond detection. Equipment might fail at a critical moment. The mathematics of searching were sobering. At the speeds Argo could travel, covering the entire search box would take weeks. The French sonar campaign would narrow down the possibilities, but only if the wreck was in a location that sonar could detect. Every day of bad weather, every hour of equipment repair, ate into the precious time available. Robert Ballard understood these odds. He had spent years preparing for this moment, developing technology, cultivating partnerships, studying every available scrap of information about the Titanic's last hours. But he also knew that the ocean was ultimately beyond human control. All he could do was prepare as thoroughly as possible, and then accept whatever the search revealed. There was one more factor in Ballard's calculations, the debris field theory we discussed earlier. Based on his experience examining the submarine wrecks for the Navy, Ballard believed that the trail of debris from the Titanic would be easier to find than the ship herself. The debris field would cover a larger area, spread across the ocean floor in a pattern that would be hard to miss. If he could find the debris, he could follow it back to the wreck. This strategy influenced the search pattern. Instead of concentrating on the most likely location of the hull, Ballard planned to sweep across the areas where debris was most likely to have scattered. It was a subtle shift in approach, but it increased the odds of finding something, even if that something was just a plate or a piece of coal. The mathematics of searching were complex, but the underlying principle was simple: patience and persistence. Cover as much ground as possible, look carefully at everything, and trust that eventually the ocean would reveal what it had hidden. Reset. Finding a ship in the vastness of the Atlantic required not just technology, but the patient logic of those who understood the ocean's patterns. The search began in July of 1985, when the French research vessel Le Surrot arrived at the designated search area and began systematically sweeping the ocean floor with sonar. Jean-Louis Mitchell and his team had prepared carefully for this moment. Their sonar system, SAR, was among the most advanced in the world, capable of detecting objects on the seafloor from a considerable distance. Towed behind the ship on a long cable, the sonar array sent acoustic signals into the deep and listened for the echoes that bounced back. Day after day, Le Surrot moved slowly back and forth across the search box, each pass adding another strip to the growing sonar map. The work was methodical, almost monotonous, a routine of careful navigation and patient observation. The crew fell into the rhythm of the search. Watches rotated, meals were eaten, readings were logged. The North Atlantic stretched gray and endless around them, offering no clue to what lay below. The sonar returned images of the seafloor, but the images were abstract, showing shapes and shadows that required interpretation. Occasionally, the sonar would detect something that warranted closer examination. The ship would slow, the operators would adjust their screens, and the team would debate whether the feature was natural or man-made. Most of the time, the answer was natural, just another rock formation, just another ripple in the sediment. The Titanic was not among them. Weather added to the challenges. The North Atlantic is notorious for unpredictable conditions, and Le Surrot encountered several storms that forced the search to pause. When the seas grew too rough, The sonar array could not be safely deployed, and the crew waited aboard the pitching vessel for conditions to improve. Time slipped away. July gave way to August, and the French team had covered a significant portion of the search area without finding the Titanic. The wreck was not where they had expected it to be. Either the calculations were wrong, or the sonar was missing something, or the ship had drifted to a location outside the search box entirely. Mitchell and his colleagues reviewed their data, looking for any hint they might have missed. They checked their equipment, confirming that it was operating correctly. They discussed alternative theories, considered whether the wreck might be buried deeper than expected. But no clear answer emerged. By mid-August, Le Suright's scheduled time in the search area was nearly over. The ship had other commitments, other projects waiting. The French team had done everything they could, sweeping more than 70% of the search box with their sonar, but the Titanic remained hidden. It was a disappointment, but not a defeat. The sonar data had eliminated large sections of ocean floor, narrowing down the possibilities for future searches. And the collaboration with the American team was just entering its second phase. Soon, Robert Ballard would arrive with Argo to continue where Le Surigt left off. Jean-Louis Mitchell and his colleagues prepared their final reports, documenting every pass, every reading, every interpretation of the data. Their work would provide the foundation for what came next. Whatever Ballard found or failed to find would build on the methodical efforts of the French campaign. The French team had spent 5 weeks at sea, had endured storms and frustration and the tedium of fruitless searching. They had not found the Titanic, but they had done their part. The search would continue without them. In the quiet of their cabins, the French researchers reflected on what they had learned. The ocean was vast and patient, indifferent to human hopes. Finding a single shipwreck in its depths was not a matter of luck but of persistence. Someone would eventually succeed, even if it was not them. They had sowed the seeds. Others would reap the harvest. Day after day, the sonar swept the seabed below, and day after day, the ocean floor revealed nothing but its ancient sediments. In late August of 1985, the research vessel Nor arrived at the search area, ready to continue where Le Surigt had left off. Aboard the American vessel, Robert Ballard and his team prepared for the final phase of the expedition. The handoff between the French and American teams was smooth, but tinged with urgency. Le Surigt had searched most of the likely areas without success, and the Nor had only about 12 days of scheduled ship time remaining before the summer season ended, and deteriorating weather would force everyone home. 12 days to find a ship that had eluded searchers for 73 years. Ballard reviewed the French data carefully, looking for patterns, gaps, anything that might suggest where the Titanic was hiding. The sonar had covered a vast area, but there were sections that had been missed due to weather or equipment issues. And there were ambiguous readings that might warrant a second look with visual cameras. The strategy for the American phase differed from the French approach. While Le Surigt had used sonar to map broad areas, Nor would use Argo's cameras to search for the debris field. Ballard was betting that the scattered remains of the Titanic's sinking would be easier to spot than the hull itself. The team worked around the clock, preparing Argo for its dives. Every cable was inspected, every connection verified. There would be no time for major repairs if something failed. Every hour was precious. On August 22nd, Argo made its first descent in the search for the Titanic. The sled dropped into the Atlantic, its lights flickering to life as it entered the darkness below. On the monitors aboard the Nor, the crew watched as images of the ocean floor began to appear, empty and featureless, a vast expanse of sediment stretching into the gloom. The search had begun. Day followed day, and Argo swept back and forth across the ocean floor. The crew rotated watches, taking turns at the monitors, eyes straining for any sign of debris or wreckage. The sediment was soft and uniform, interrupted only occasionally by rocks or bottom-dwelling creatures. The mood aboard the Nor was tense but focused. Everyone knew what was at stake. Years of preparation, months of planning, careers invested in this single opportunity. If they failed to find the Titanic in the time remaining, there was no guarantee that another chance would come. But the ocean revealed nothing. Day after day, the cameras showed only sediment and darkness. The countdown continued, and hope, though tested, persisted. As one ship departed and another arrived, the search entered its final chapter, with only days remaining before the ocean would keep its secret for another year. Before we arrive at the moment of discovery, let us pause to consider what life was like for the crew aboard the Nor during those long days of searching. For to understand the discovery, we must understand the patience and persistence that made it possible. A research vessel at sea is its own small world, a community of scientists and sailors bound together by shared purpose and shared confinement. The Nor was not a large ship, roughly 270 feet in length, designed for oceanographic research rather than comfort. Every inch of space was used efficiently, with laboratories, workshops, and living quarters packed together in close proximity. The crew numbered around 50 people, including scientists, engineers, technicians, and the ship's officers and sailors who kept the vessel running. They came from different backgrounds and different institutions, but for the duration of the expedition, they were a single team, united by the goal of finding the Titanic. Daily life aboard the Nor was structured around the watch system. The search ran 24 hours a day, and the crew rotated in shifts to ensure that someone was always monitoring Argo's cameras. A typical watch lasted 4 hours, during which the operators would stare at the monitors, watching the ocean floor drift slowly past, alert for any sign of debris or wreckage. The watches were demanding work, requiring constant attention despite the monotony of the images. Hour after hour, the seafloor looked much the same, a soft carpet of sediment interrupted only by occasional rocks or bottom-dwelling creatures. The temptation to let attention wander was ever present, but the crew knew that a moment's distraction could mean missing the very thing they sought. Between watches, the crew found what rest they could in the shared cabins below deck. The bunks were narrow, the quarters cramped, and the constant motion of the ship made deep sleep elusive. But fatigue was a constant companion on a research expedition, and everyone learned to catch what rest they could in fragments between duties. Meals were served in the galley, a compact dining area where the crew gathered to eat and talk. The food was simple but nourishing, prepared by the ship's cook with limited resources and no access to fresh supplies. Coffee flowed constantly, the fuel that kept the watches going through long nights of staring at screens. The galley was also a social hub, a place where off-duty crew members could gather to share stories, play cards, or simply sit in companionable silence. Conversations ranged from technical discussions of the search to personal anecdotes from lives back home. Friendships formed, bonds strengthened by the shared intensity of the experience. Throughout the vessel, the atmosphere was one of focused determination mixed with underlying tension. Everyone knew that time was running short. The weather window was narrowing, and each day that passed without a discovery brought the end of the expedition closer. Yet there was also hope. The technology was sound, the strategy was logical, and every member of the team believed that the Titanic was out there, waiting to be found. That belief sustained them through the tedium and the exhaustion, kept them attentive at the monitors even when their eyes burned from fatigue. Robert Ballard moved through the ship, checking on the equipment, consulting with his colleagues, reviewing the data that accumulated hour by hour. He maintained an outward calm, projecting confidence to the crew, but inwardly he felt the pressure. This was his dream, years in the making, and its fulfillment or failure rested on what the next few days would reveal. The ship itself seemed to embody the mood of the search. The constant hum of the engines, the gentle roll of the deck, the soft glow of monitors in darkened rooms, all created an atmosphere of focused waiting. Outside, the Atlantic stretched gray and endless in every direction. Inside, a small community of searchers kept their vigil. And so the days passed, one after another, each bringing the expedition closer to its conclusion. The ocean floor revealed nothing. The calendar advanced, and the watchers continued to watch. In the quiet hours between watches, the crew found comfort in small routines. A warm meal, a few pages of a book, the steady rhythm of the ship at sea. The night of August 31st, 1985, began like so many nights before it. The Nor moved slowly across the surface of the Atlantic, her engines humming steadily, her wake dissolving into the darkness behind her. Below the ship, at the end of a cable nearly 4 miles long, Argo drifted above the ocean floor, its cameras recording the endless expanse of sediment that had greeted every pass for days. In the control room, a skeleton crew maintained the watch. Most of the expedition's members had retired to their bunks, exhausted from weeks of searching, leaving the overnight hours to a small team of dedicated observers. The room was dim, illuminated primarily by the glow of the monitors that displayed Argo's video feed. The mood was subdued. After so many days of finding nothing, the initial excitement of the search had given way to a kind of patient resignation. The crew still believed the Titanic was out there, still hoped that each new frame of video might reveal something remarkable. But hope had become quiet, tempered by the reality of the vast, empty ocean floor that continued to pass beneath Argo's cameras. The coffee was poured and sipped. Quiet conversations came and went. The clock ticked toward midnight. At that hour, the expedition was entering its final days. The weather window was closing, and soon the Nor would have to turn for home regardless of what had been found. Every hour that passed without a discovery brought the end of the search closer. Outside, the Atlantic was calm, the surface smooth and dark beneath a sky full of stars. It was the kind of night that sailors call peaceful, when the ocean seems to rest, and the world feels suspended between one day and the next. Inside the control room, the watchers continued their vigil, unaware that everything was about to change. The ship was now moving across an area where the debris field was theoretically most likely to be found. Ballard's calculations, based on the drift patterns and the currents, suggested that if debris had scattered from the sinking ship, it would have settled somewhere in this region. The passes of the previous days had found nothing, but the search pattern was now reaching into new territory. Midnight came and went. The calendar turned from August to September. In bunks throughout the ship, crew members slept, dreaming perhaps of home or of the great ship they sought. In the control room, the watchers continued to stare at the monitors. And then, at approximately 12:48 in the morning, something appeared on the screen. At first, it was just a shape, a shadow in the sediment that seemed different from the rocks and ripples that had come before. One of the watchers, a young crew member named Bill Lange, leaned closer to the monitor, his attention suddenly sharpening. The shape grew more distinct as Argo passed over it. It was circular, large, covered with sediment but clearly man-made. And then another shape appeared beside it, and another. Objects scattered across the ocean floor, emerging from the darkness like ghosts. Lange's voice was quiet but urgent. "There's something here." The other watchers gathered around the screen. More objects appeared, bottles, pieces of metal, fragments of things that had no business being at the bottom of the Atlantic. The sediment was no longer empty. It was littered with debris. Someone ran to wake Robert Ballard. Within minutes, the control room was crowded with crew members, some still in their sleeping clothes, all staring at the monitors with expressions of disbelief and dawning wonder. The video feed showed more and more debris, a scatter pattern that extended across the ocean floor, exactly as Ballard had predicted. They had found it. After 73 years, after dozens of failed expeditions, after weeks of searching that had seemed to lead nowhere, they had finally found the debris field of the Titanic. But the ship herself had not yet appeared. Somewhere ahead, following the trail of scattered objects, the great liner waited in the darkness, and Argo was heading straight for her. The clock showed 1 o'clock in the morning. The calendar showed September 1st, 1985. And in the control room of the Nor, history was unfolding one frame at a time. As midnight passed and the calendar turned to September, the weary watchers continued their vigil, not knowing that the next hour would change everything. As Argo continued its slow passage across the ocean floor, the debris on the monitors grew denser and more recognizable. What had begun as scattered fragments became a field of objects. each one a silent witness to the night of April 15th, 1912. And then, at approximately 1 o'clock in the morning, the object appeared that removed all doubt. It was a boiler, one of the massive cylindrical furnaces that had once powered the Titanic across the Atlantic. The shape was unmistakable, its distinctive circular form and riveted construction matching exactly the boilers that had been photographed on the ship before her maiden voyage. This was not a rock formation, not an ambiguous shadow. This was a piece of the Titanic, lying on the ocean floor where it had fallen more than 7 decades before. In the control room, the reaction was one of stunned silence followed by quiet exclamation. Someone said, "That's it! That's a boiler!" And suddenly, after all the years of dreaming and planning and searching, the reality of what they had found began to sink in. Robert Ballard stared at the screen, the image he had imagined for so long now actually before his eyes. He would later describe the moment as one of overwhelming emotion, a mixture of triumph and sorrow that left him momentarily speechless. They had found the Titanic, but in finding her, they had also returned to the site of one of history's great tragedies. The crew crowded around the monitors, watching as more debris appeared, each object adding to the certainty of the discovery. Bottles and dishes, pieces of metal and fragments of wood, the scattered remains of a ship that had once been the largest and most luxurious vessel afloat. Each piece told part of the story, and together they formed a trail that led toward something even more significant. The boiler was confirmation, but it was not the ship herself. Somewhere ahead, following the path of debris, the main wreckage waited. And Argo continued its slow journey, cameras recording every foot of ocean floor, moving steadily toward the moment when the Titanic would finally be seen. In the control room, the mood shifted from excitement to something more contemplative. Someone noted the time, and the crew realized with a start that it was approaching 2 o'clock in the morning, the approximate hour when the Titanic had finally slipped beneath the waves all those years ago. They were not just scientists and explorers now. They were witnesses, returning to a place of profound loss at the very hour when that loss had occurred. The parallel was not lost on anyone. The celebration, if it could be called that, was muted. There were handshakes and embraces, quiet words of congratulation. But there was also an awareness of solemnity, a recognition that this discovery carried responsibilities as well as rewards. As the minutes passed, the debris field continued to unfold on the monitors. And somewhere ahead, still unseen but now certainly close, the Titanic herself waited to be found. The night was not yet over. The greatest images were still to come. In that single frame, 73 years of mystery began to dissolve, and the watchers understood that they were seeing something no living person had ever seen. As Argo continued its journey across the ocean floor, the full extent of the debris field gradually revealed itself. What had begun as scattered objects became a vast spread of artifacts, covering an area that stretched for hundreds of meters across the sediment. The cameras recorded everything they passed. Here was a section of railing, twisted but recognizable. There was a collection of dishes, some intact, others broken, piled together as if set down by an invisible hand. Wine bottles lay half buried in the sediment, their corks still in place after more than 7 decades. Pieces of coal, once intended to feed the ship's boilers, dotted the seafloor like black stones. The variety of objects was remarkable. Personal belongings mingled with ship's equipment. Pieces of furniture rested beside mechanical components. The debris told the story of a ship coming apart as it sank, spilling its contents into the water column where currents scattered them across the bottom. Some objects were poignant in their ordinariness. A shoe lying alone on the sediment, its leather preserved by the cold water. A hairbrush. A ceramic doll's head. These were not just artifacts, but remnants of lives, quiet reminders that the Titanic had carried more than cargo on her final voyage. The crew aboard the Nor watched in silence as the debris field unfolded. There was no commentary adequate to the moment. The objects spoke for themselves, each one a small tragedy, a small story, a small piece of a larger catastrophe that had shaken the world. Robert Ballard later wrote about the experience of seeing the debris field for the first time. He described the mixture of scientific excitement and profound sadness, the awareness that every object represented someone's possession, someone's hope, someone's life interrupted. The pattern of the debris revealed something about the sinking itself. The lighter objects had drifted farther from the main wreckage, carried by currents as they fell through the water column. The heavier pieces had settled closer to where the ship had finally come to rest. By mapping the debris field, scientists would eventually be able to reconstruct the ship's final moments with greater precision than ever before. But on that night, there was no time for detailed analysis. The cameras continued to record, the crew continued to watch, and the debris field continued to reveal its secrets, one object at a time. The hours passed, and still the debris appeared. The field was larger than anyone had expected, a testament to the violence of the sinking and the forces that had torn the great ship apart. And somewhere at the heart of this scatter, still unseen, the main sections of the Titanic waited. The night deepened. The stars wheeled overhead, invisible to the crew in the darkened control room. And below, in the eternal darkness of the ocean floor, the trail of debris led onward toward its source. Object by object, the story of the Titanic's final moments began to emerge from the sediment, each piece a quiet testament to lives interrupted. And then out of the darkness she appeared. The bow of the Titanic rose from the sediment like a monument, its lines still graceful, its form still recognizable despite the decades of submersion. The cameras of Argo swept across the forecastle, revealing details that matched perfectly with photographs taken before the ship's maiden voyage. The anchor chains, massive links of iron, lay draped across the deck. The railings, though encrusted with marine growth, still stood where they had been installed in the shipyard at Belfast. It was a moment of profound discovery. For 73 years, the Titanic had been invisible, her final resting place unknown to the world. Now, for the first time since that April night in 1912, human eyes were seeing the great ship again. The bow section, it would later be determined, was remarkably intact. It had settled upright on the ocean floor, its prow buried in the sediment, its forward decks largely preserved. The anchor crane stood where it had always stood. The foremast, though collapsed, was still recognizable. Even the deck planking, though obscured by sediment and marine life, retained something of its original appearance. In the control room of the Nor, the crew watched in wonder. Here was the ship that had captivated the world, the symbol of an era, the subject of countless books and films and legends. And here she was, real and tangible, resting in the darkness where she had fallen so long ago. Robert Ballard described the moment as overwhelming. To see the ship after years of imagining her, to witness the reality after so many dreams, was an experience that transcended the scientific. This was history made visible, tragedy made present, memory made real. The cameras continued to record as Argo passed over the bow section. Details emerged that would later be analyzed in minute detail. The condition of the hull, the position of the anchor, the state of the deck equipment. Each image added to the scientific understanding of the wreck while also adding to the emotional weight of the discovery. There was no celebration in the control room now. The mood was one of quiet reverence. The crew understood that they were looking at more than a shipwreck. They were looking at a gravesite, a memorial, a place where more than 1,500 people had met their end. The bow was only part of the story. As subsequent passes would reveal, the Titanic had broken apart during her sinking, and the stern section lay some distance away, in far worse condition than the bow. But on this night, the first night of discovery, the bow was enough. It was proof. It was confirmation. It was the answer to a question that had haunted the world for generations. The Titanic had been found. And then the ship herself appeared, her bow rising from the seafloor like a monument to an age that had long since passed into memory. As dawn broke over the Atlantic on that September morning, the crew of the Nor paused to acknowledge the gravity of what they had found. Someone had checked the calendar and noted the coincidence. The discovery had occurred in the early hours of September 1st, almost exactly at the time of night when the Titanic had made her final plunge beneath the waves 73 years before. Whether by chance or by some deeper pattern, the finding had come at an hour heavy with memory. Robert Ballard gathered the crew on deck for a moment of remembrance. The atmosphere was solemn, appropriate to the occasion. This was not merely a scientific discovery, but a return to a place of profound loss. More than 1,500 people had perished in these waters, and their memory deserved acknowledgement. The flag aboard the Nor was lowered to half-staff. The crew stood in silence, heads bowed, as the sun rose over the Atlantic. No words were spoken for a long moment. The only sounds were the gentle slap of waves against the hull and the distant cry of seabirds. When Ballard finally spoke, his words were simple. He acknowledged the tragedy that had occurred in these waters, the lives that had been lost, the families that had been forever changed. He expressed the hope that the discovery would honor the memory of those who had perished rather than exploit it. The crew listened in silence. Many of them had been focused on the technical challenges of the search, the excitement of the hunt. Now, in the quiet of the morning, the human dimension of the discovery became real. These were not just images on a screen. This was a gravesite. This was sacred ground. A brief service followed, adapted from the words that had been spoken over the graves of the Titanic victims in 1912. It was a moment of connection across the decades, a bridge between the present and the past. And then slowly the mood shifted. The solemnity remained, but alongside it came a sense of purpose. The discovery carried responsibilities. The wreck must be documented, studied, and ultimately protected. The memory of the Titanic and those who sailed on her must be preserved. The sun rose higher, burning off the morning mist. The Atlantic sparkled in the golden light, and below, in the darkness that the sunlight would never reach, the Titanic rested in her final berth. In the morning light, the crew paused to remember that this was more than a discovery. It was a gravesite, and those who found it understood the solemnity of their work. In the days that followed the initial discovery, Argo made repeated passes over the wreck site, building a comprehensive visual record of what lay on the ocean floor. Each pass revealed new details, new insights, new questions. The bow section, as we have seen, was remarkably well preserved. Standing upright on the seafloor, it retained much of its original form, a ghostly echo of the ship that had departed Southampton with such fanfare in April of 1912. The forward decks, though encrusted with sediment and marine growth, were recognizable. The anchor crane still stood. The railing still traced its familiar arc. But closer examination revealed the effects of more than 7 decades on the ocean floor. Strange formations, later named rusticles, hung from the hull like frozen orange waterfalls. These were the work of iron-eating bacteria, organisms that had been slowly consuming the ship's metal, transforming it into fragile, rust-colored structures that would crumble at the slightest touch. The rusticles were beautiful in their way, delicate and organic, more like sculpture than decay. But they were also a reminder that the Titanic was not eternal. Slowly, imperceptibly, the ocean was reclaiming what had been taken from it. Eventually, perhaps in decades, perhaps in centuries, the great ship would dissolve entirely, leaving nothing but a shadow on the sediment. The stern section told a different story. Located some 2,000 feet from the bow, it had suffered far more severely during the sinking. Where the bow had descended relatively intact, the stern had imploded under the pressure, breaking apart as it fell, striking the bottom with tremendous force. The stern lay twisted and scattered across the ocean floor. Decks had collapsed onto one another. Compartments had been torn open. The recognizable forms of the ship's architecture had been reduced to tangled wreckage. The contrast between bow and stern helped scientists understand what had happened during the sinking. The ship had broken apart on the surface, splitting between the third and fourth funnels. The bow had filled with water and descended with a certain dignity, settling gently on the bottom. The stern had risen briefly into the air as the bow pulled downward, then broken free and plunged to its own destruction. The debris field between the two sections contained thousands of objects, the contents of the ship scattered during the catastrophic breakup. Plates and bottles and pieces of furniture, coal and machinery and personal belongings. Each object had a story, and together they formed a record of the disaster more detailed than any survivor's account. The cameras recorded everything, hour after hour, pass after pass. When the expedition finally ended, they had accumulated more footage of the Titanic than anyone had ever imagined possible. It would take years to analyze all the images, to catalog all the objects, to answer all the questions that the discovery had raised. But even in those first days, certain conclusions were clear. The Titanic had been found. Her location was now known, and the long silence of the Atlantic had finally been broken. Each pass of the cameras revealed new details, and slowly, scientists began to understand what the ocean had done to the great ship in her long sleep below. All journeys must end, and so too did the voyage of the Nor. With the discovery confirmed and documented, with hundreds of hours of footage stored safely in the ship's archives, the vessel turned her bow toward home. The crossing back to Woods Hole took several days, and the crew used the time to process what they had experienced. The intensity of the search, the exhaustion of the long watches, and the overwhelming emotion of the discovery had left everyone drained. Now, with the ocean stretching calm around them and the work completed, there was time for reflection. Robert Ballard spent hours reviewing the footage, studying the images that would soon be shared with the world. He made notes, sketched diagrams, and began to plan the scientific papers and presentations that would follow. But he also allowed himself moments of simple wonder, watching the Titanic appear again and again on the screen, still amazed that the dream of so many years had finally come true. The crew talked among themselves about what they had seen. Stories were shared, impressions compared. The experience had been profound for everyone, regardless of their role in the expedition. Even the sailors who had stayed above decks, who had never seen the monitors, understood that they had participated in something historic. As the coast of Massachusetts appeared on the horizon, the mood aboard the Nor shifted again. The private world of the expedition was about to give way to the public world of announcement and explanation. The discovery would soon belong not just to the crew, but to the entire world. Preparations were made for the arrival. The footage was secured. Statements were drafted. The crew changed into clean clothes, tidied their quarters, made ready for the reception that awaited them. The Nor entered Woods Hole Harbor on September 9, 1985. Waiting on the dock was a crowd of colleagues, journalists, family members, and well-wishers. The word had already spread. The Titanic had been found. The crew disembarked to cheers and applause. There were embraces and handshakes, questions shouted and cameras flashing. After weeks at sea, after the solitude of the search and the intensity of the discovery, the sudden immersion in public attention was almost overwhelming. But there would be time for all of that later. For now, the crew was simply glad to be home, glad to stand on solid ground, glad to know that the great work was done. The voyage was over, but the story of the discovery was just beginning. As the Nor turned toward home, her crew carried with them images that would soon be shared with a waiting world. The announcement of the Titanic's discovery sparked a wave of interest that swept around the globe. Within hours of the news becoming public, it was the leading story on every network, the headline in every newspaper, the subject of conversation in homes and offices and schools worldwide. The Titanic had never really left the public consciousness. Books and films had kept the story alive, and the mystery of the ship's location had only added to her legend. Now that mystery was solved, and the world responded with a mixture of fascination and reverence. Press conferences were held at Woods Hole, where Robert Ballard presented the footage and answered questions from assembled journalists. The images were remarkable, unlike anything the public had seen before. The ghostly bow emerging from the darkness, the debris scattered across the sediment, the rusticles draping the hull like frozen tears. The footage was broadcast worldwide, allowing millions of people to see the Titanic for the first time since she had disappeared beneath the waves. For many, it was an emotional experience. The ship was no longer just a story. She was real, visible, present in a way she had never been before. Among those watching were survivors of the disaster and their descendants. By 1985, only a handful of survivors remained alive, all of them having been young children at the time of the sinking. For these survivors, the discovery stirred memories and emotions that had never entirely faded. Interviews with survivors appeared in newspapers and on television. They spoke of their experiences that night, of the confusion and the cold and the terrible cries in the darkness. They spoke of the years that followed, of carrying the memory of the Titanic through their entire lives. And they spoke of the discovery of what it meant to know that the ship had finally been found. The response was not entirely celebratory. Some questioned whether the wreck should have been disturbed at all, whether the site should have been left in peace as a memorial to those who had died. These voices raised important questions about the ethics of deep-sea exploration, questions that would become more pressing in the years that followed. But for the most part, the response was one of wonder and gratitude. The discovery had answered a question that had haunted the world for generations. It had brought closure, in some sense, to a story that had never properly ended. Robert Ballard became, for a time, one of the most famous scientists in the world. He gave interviews and lectures, wrote articles and books, and advocated for the protection of the Titanic wreck site. He would return to the site the following year with the submersible Alvin, making the first manned visit to the wreck and capturing even more detailed images. But he also emphasized that the discovery was not his alone. It belonged to the French team who had searched before him, to the crew who had kept the watches, to the engineers who had built Argo, to all the dreamers and planners who had worked for years to make the expedition possible. Across continents and time zones, the news traveled the Titanic had been found, and a new chapter in her story had begun. The discovery of the Titanic in 1985 was not an ending but a beginning. In the years that followed, the wreck became the subject of continued exploration, intense debate, and enduring fascination. Robert Ballard returned to the site in 1986, this time with the submersible Alvin and the small robotic vehicle Jason Jr. For the first time, human eyes looked directly upon the Titanic, not through the remote cameras of Argo, but through the portholes of a vessel that had descended to the wreck itself. Jason Jr. was sent inside the ship, swimming through doorways and corridors, capturing images of spaces that had been sealed from the world for more than 7 decades. The grand staircase, or what remained of it, the first-class cabins, the officers' quarters. Each image was a revelation, a window into a world frozen in time. But the subsequent explorations also raised difficult questions. Some expeditions recovered artifacts from the wreck site, bringing objects to the surface for display in museums and traveling exhibitions. These recoveries were controversial. Some argued that the artifacts should be left in place, that the wreck site was a gravesite that should not be disturbed. Others contended that recovery was necessary for preservation, that the objects would otherwise be lost to decay. The debate continues to this day. Laws have been passed to protect the Titanic wreck site, limiting access and regulating what can be done there. But the ship continues to deteriorate, the rusticles slowly consuming her iron, the ocean gradually reclaiming what it holds. Scientists estimate that the Titanic may disappear entirely within the next few decades, dissolving into the sediment that surrounds her. When that day comes, only the artifacts recovered and the images captured will remain to document what once lay on the ocean floor. The discovery of the Titanic also transformed our understanding of the disaster itself. By studying the wreck, scientists were able to reconstruct the sinking with unprecedented detail. They confirmed that the ship had broken apart on the surface, not during the descent. They mapped the debris field and traced the trajectories of falling objects. They analyzed the damage to the hull and debated the role of the rivets in the ship's failure. The Titanic's story, always powerful, became even richer as new evidence came to light. The discovery had not solved all the mysteries, but it had provided answers to questions that had puzzled researchers for decades. In the years that followed, the discovery opened new doors and raised new questions, ensuring that the Titanic's story would continue to unfold. And so we come to the end of our journey together. We have traveled from the quiet offices of Woods Hole to the rolling decks of the Nore, from the laboratories of France to the darkness of the Atlantic floor. We have followed the patient dreamers who refused to accept that the Titanic would remain hidden forever. We have witnessed the long nights of searching and the sudden, astonishing moment when the search finally succeeded. 73 years of mystery ended on a September morning in 1985, when the cameras of Argo first captured the image of a boiler resting on the sediment. And then, soon after, the majestic bow of the great ship herself. The men and women who found the Titanic understood that they were doing more than locating a shipwreck. They were returning to a place of memory, a site of loss, a reminder of human ambition and human fragility. They approached their work with respect, and they shared their discovery with reverence. Today, the Titanic rests where she has rested for more than a century, slowly surrendering to the ocean that claimed her. But her story endures. In museums and books, in films and documentaries, in the memories of those who have seen her images and been moved by her fate, the Titanic lives on. And perhaps that is the true legacy of the discovery. Not just that the ship was found, but that finding her allowed the world to remember, to honor, and to reflect. Thank you for joining us on this voyage. May your rest be peaceful, your dreams be gentle, and your sleep be as calm as the sea on a quiet night. And so we return to the surface, carrying with us the quiet triumph of those who sought, those who found, and those who chose to remember with dignity.